This presentation takes an approach wherein I try to put the creation of MPOs in perspective to the development and growth of the national interstate system. For purposes of hopefully sparking some additional interest, I have also thrown in a couple of what I think are interesting transportation related tidbits. So this is a brief history of how MPOs came to be and what they do. In 1919, then Lieutenant Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower was assigned to accompany the transcontinental motor convoy as it journeyed from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. He was dismayed. The trip took over 2 months. The roads were in horrible condition. Very few were paved. And not a week went by without major breakdowns, vehicular and otherwise. He recognized right then and there, from strictly a national security point of view, this was an amazing, tremendous impediment to the movement of men and materiel should an invasion occur. And you need to keep in mind, this is 1919, shortly after the end of World War I, and Eisenhower had seen what modern war machines could do, fast ships and airplanes, and there was a real concern of invasion. He determined that should he ever be in a position of power to make a difference, he would undertake an initiative to improve the roadways nationwide. This idea was further validated during World War II, ironically, when the Allies invaded Germany. It was the Autobahn system in Germany that aided the rapid movement of his troops. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected the 34th President of the United States. Working with Congress, he developed the Federal Aid Highway Act, which was passed in 1956 and signed into law in 1957. This bill was a massive infusion of funding to the states, hundreds of millions of dollars for the design and construction of what would become the interstate highway system. It is important to note that it was the states that received the funds. It was the states that were responsible for developing the alignments, and it was their responsibility to construct these ribbons of concrete stretching across and knitting our nation together. Local governments, for the most part, had very little say. In anticipation of the passage of the 1956 Highway Bill, several cities and communities across the country began to develop various approaches and responses. In Chicago, the city, Cook County, the state of Illinois, the University of Chicago, Northwestern University, and the Federal Department of Roads created a partnership which they called the Chicago Area Transportation Study, or CATS, and this was specifically created to address the issue of the interstate highway system. In Denver, there was an impetus for the creation of the Denver Regional Council of Governments, DRCOG. This organization would address, among many other issues, the placement of two anticipated highways through their region. Question 1. What does an undertaker in Kansas City, Missouri in 1889 have to do with transportation modeling? The answer is at the end of the presentation. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1962 took the Chicago model, defined the arrangement as a metropolitan planning organization, and applied it nationwide. Any area that had an urbanized population of 50,000 people or more must create an MPO. And in a very true sense, the Chicago Area Transportation Study was the first MPO. The name was also copied by locals across the country. You had the Daytona Beach Area Transportation Study and the Orlando Urban Area Transportation Study in Florida, and you have the Salem-Kaiser Area Transportation Study in Oregon. This bill also included the language that has been contained in all federal transportation bills ever since. It required that all transportation projects in an urbanized area be developed based on a continuing, comprehensive, and cooperative process known as the 3C process. The primary problem with the bill was that the federal government did not offer any specific direction or regulations as to the roles and responsibilities of MPOs. As a result, a lot of states looked upon these organizations as meddling local officials. In 1991, the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, ICE-T, was signed into law by George H.W. Bush. This bill had a number of significant changes to both the role and the responsibilities of MPOs. It gave the larger MPOs, those serving populations of 200,000 or more, teeth. They now had the authority to say no to the state should the local officials object to a transportation project. It also required that the MPOs develop a fiscally constrained long-range plan. Prior to this, a significant portion of MPOs just threw just about everything they wanted into the long-range plan so that their pet projects would be eligible for federal funding. This new stipulation required that MPOs, in coordination with states, develop financial forecasts and that the estimated cost of the project in the long-range plan not exceed the estimated revenues in that financial forecast. Projects identified in the Transportation Improvement Program, the short-term program, must come from the long-range plan. And finally, the Transportation Bill was tied very closely to the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Conformity became de rigueur for a lot of MPOs. The bill also included a phrase, projects of regional significance. This meant that any project deemed to significantly impact the transportation system, regardless of funding source, must be approved by the MPO for inclusion in the RTP. The bill also stressed that all documentation, specifically the Unified Planning Work Program, which is the program budget for an MPO, must become more quote-unquote user-friendly. Question 2. What does the wheelbase of a roaming chariot, the width of the chariot, have to do with the size of the solid rocket fuel boosters on the space shuttle? Answers at the end. So, MPOs are required to develop several documents by the federal government. The Regional Transportation Plan is a long-range plan that must have an horizon year of 20 to 25 years. It must contain all capacity enhancement projects, and it must be fiscally constrained. It must identify future transportation needs and identify how the plan intends to meet those needs. Many RTPs, as they're called, have a wish list. In Medford, this is called the Tier 2 projects. It's a list of needed but as yet unfunded projects. And the RTP must be updated on a regular basis. Our MPOs, we do it every 4 years because we are still in non-attainment. The Transportation Improvement Program identifies how, in the short term, in Oregon 4 years, how the RTP will be implemented. Projects in this document must come from the RTP, and the document must also be fiscally constrained, and it is updated on a regular basis, again, every 4 years in Oregon. This document covers a 2-year period, in Oregon a 1-year period, and essentially is the program budget for the MPO. It identifies the planning efforts and studies that the MPO intends to undertake over the next year. It identifies the amount of funding to be used, federal, state, and local, that is available, and how much the studies are anticipated to cost. And it also identifies who will be doing the work, whether it be the MPO staff, the state, and or consultants. It is the very basic this is the basic what and why about MPOs. MPOs do many other things and take on multiple additional roles across the country, including some operate transit. They don't all have the same structure, size, or resources, but they are all required to undertake the tasks I've outlined. What does an undertaker in Kansas City, Missouri in 1889 have to do with the transportation model? In 1889, Almon B. Strouger, an undertaker in Kansas City, invented the first automated telephone system. This system, albeit greatly improved over time, actually became the industry standard across the country. And it remained, granted with improvements, but pretty much the same until 1970. While this system was in place, it became much more efficient to call, and more telephones were coming online, and that brought in a whole new problem. How do you route those calls? What's the shortest path to route those calls? And many mathematicians at the time, and AT&T hired several out of universities to work on this problem. Um, and one, a guy by the name of Dijkstra, created the shortest path algorithm that most industry components use. In 1957, the Chicago Area Transportation Study borrowed AT&T's shortest path algorithm and adopted it for their traffic assignment model. And although things have changed a lot in the four-step model that is commonly used for transportation planning, this one thing still remains a key component, pretty much unchanged since it was created. What does a Roman chariot have to do with the size of the solid rocket boosters on the space shuttle? The Romans pretty much conquered all of the known world of their time. And one of the secrets of their success was their engineering prowess, particularly their ability to build roads, very straight, very durable. It allowed them to move men and material rapidly from place to place, thereby ensuring the safety of the empire. The typical Roman road is built to accommodate the wheelbase of a Roman chariot and the legions following it in military formation. In 1803, Robert Trevithick invented the first steam locomotive that would run on rails. The weight of the locomotive itself, along with the steel for rails and wood beams, required a very sound foundation. And looking around, the British realized they had the perfect base, and ones that went directly to important populated places in England: London, Manchester, Bath, Dover, Roman roads. And they built their rail system to be accommodated by the width of these roads. Or in this case, the gauge of the railroad track was that width of the road. And this gauge, this wide gauge, was adopted by most countries, including the United States. And so when the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle were designed, they were designed and built by Thiokol in Brigham City, Utah. And they were to be delivered to the Kennedy Space Center by train. To get there, they had to go through the Rockies. And in this one particular area, there was one particular tunnel that had a very narrow diameter. And due to the diameter of that tunnel, Thiokol had to redesign the solid rocket boosters to fit through that tunnel so that they could eventually get to Kennedy Space Center and be put on the space shuttle. And so in a very real sense, the width of a Roman chariot had a direct impact on the diameter of the solid rocket boosters of the space shuttle. And that's my presentation. Thank you.